She loves travel and learning an incredible amount of new stuff. .NET, serverless, full stack web apps. Please join me in welcoming Melissa.
Hi everybody, thanks for coming to my talk here today at Programmable. I'm very excited to be here. I was part of the Vox Days that the people ran last year, and it's exciting to see a new conference that they've put together with Programmable. I also used to live here in Melbourne, but recently moved over to Western Australia, living in a wine region over there, which we will hear more about a little bit later in the talk. But as mentioned, so my talk is all about how you can work with Azure Static Web Apps with full stack .NET. So in this talk, we'll take a look at Azure Static Web Apps, what that service is, and all of the great features that are available for you within the Azure Static Web App service. We'll look at how we can build and use this service for our full stack applications using full stack .NET with Blazor WebAssembly in the front end and powerful .NET APIs in the back end. We'll look at some of the ways that you can do your debugging and deployment with Azure Static Web Apps and how it can really help you with that developer lifecycle and getting your code out to the cloud very quickly. And we'll take a look at some of the advanced scenarios, getting into some of the really cool features and more enterprise, bigger level applications and how you can use it for all different types of scenarios. But first, a little bit more about me. So my name is Melissa Houghton, and I'm a lead software engineer in developer relations for Xenix, who are part of Mantle Group, who are one of the sponsors of the conference here today. So also like to thank all of the sponsors who made the conference happen, as well as the organizers who put on the event today. I'm also a Microsoft MVP in developer technologies, and I try to be active on different tech socials and share different things that I'm working on or learning about. So please feel free to connect with me and follow me on any of those things, whatever site that you're on at the moment. Also, feel free to take pictures and tweet or toot or whatever platform you're using of my talk as I'm going about here today. So Azure Static Web Apps. What is Azure Static Web Apps? Well, it's a service offering from Azure to allow you to very quickly build and host your static web applications. But it really focuses on that developer-first approach. So what it does is it takes your code changes and it sets it up so that from your code commits and your deployments into your main branch, it'll automatically do some builds for you. It'll set up your GitHub Actions or different kinds of build pipelines as part of the service, and it'll deploy it into Azure and take care of all of the hosting and configuration and management for you. So it's a serverless solution offering. So as in the name, you're using static content in the front end. So this is generally your HTML, your CSS, your JavaScript, that kind of stuff. But we're looking at how we can use it with .NET in the front end. So we're using something called Blazor WebAssembly, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. And then on the back end, there's a few different API options, but natively built in is a managed option for Azure Functions. So you can have some really powerful APIs in the back end powering your static content all set up for you within the Static Web App service. So part of it as that serverless offering is it's doing a lot of that nitty-gritty configuration in the cloud that you might not have to deal with yourself. So Azure Static Web Apps has some really great features to help you get started. So it has globally distributed hosting, which means that your static content is available everywhere for all of your customers or whoever might be accessing your sites globally in really fast load times and all of that. It has some nice features to help you get up and running very quickly with streamlined build and deployment. And it has custom domains available, so you don't have to use the .azure website's URL, or it gives you a funny generated URL as well. You can customize it for your company or whatever brand you want to have. And also automatically configure and set up your SSL certificates as well, no matter what plan option you're on. There's also some powerful built-in authentication and routing rules, so you have that Azure security from the very beginning without having to do a whole lot of work in configuration yourself. It helps you set up some generated staging environments so you can very quickly see your changes as you're going through with your pull requests and all that kind of stuff as well. No more of this, oh, it worked on my machine. You can actually go look at a staging environment which is created within your pull request directly. And it has some powerful tools to help with that building and deployment, including a custom CLI just for the static web apps themselves, as well as support for things like the .NET CLI and Azure CLI and all of that good stuff as well. So I'm talking all about how you can use it with .NET, because I'm a .NET developer and I love working with full stack .NET. But given its static content in the front end, you're not limited to just using .NET. It supports pretty much any other static front-end framework you can think of. So if you're working with Vue, your React, your Angular, your Svelte, any of those other ones, you can use static web apps for that as well. But I want to show you how we can use it with full stack .NET. So I mentioned it's all about, static web apps with full stack .NET. They go very nicely together. So I mentioned that full stack .NET is something that I really enjoy working with. And why would you want to do this? Why would you want to use .NET instead of maybe your Reacts or your Vues or whatnot? Well, .NET as a platform in general is free and it's open source. It's very powerful. It's cross-platform, and it's one of the fastest development frameworks out there for you to use. It's outperformed Node and Java Servlet in some recent tech-empowered tests that they've had to measure the speed of different frameworks. It's very modern, it's productive, it's something that Microsoft is really investing very heavily into, and there's tons of really great free learning resources out there for people to get up and running using .NET. It's also very trusted and secure, and you have a lot of that nice integration and features when you're working with things like Azure Cloud. So using .NET on the front end, I mentioned we're using something called Blazor WebAssembly. So Blazor WebAssembly is a full-featured front-end framework which is actually running your .NET code in your client browser using something called WebAssembly. So instead of having your JavaScript, which is running natively in the browser, we can now run pretty much anything natively in the browser using this tool called WebAssembly. So what Microsoft has done is set up Blazor to use this WebAssembly tool to allow you to write your client code in .NET. So it means that you can have shared component models across the client and server. So if you have your full stack .NET applications, you can have shared libraries across the two. You can have everything within one code base using your same Visual Studio tools and things that you're used to with your normal .NET development, which I think is really cool. So you can build those really powerful .NET applications. And this is just one of the things that is working within .NET. There is actually two different ways that you can build Blazor web applications. So we're focusing here specifically on the Blazor WebAssembly because that's what runs in the client browser and makes it static content, so works well with the static web apps. But there's also something called Blazor Server, which runs on the server side and sends it to the client side using SignalR. But unfortunately, because it's not static content anymore, you can't use it with static web apps. But they're very similar, and Blazor WebAssembly is really powerful to use. So even within Blazor WebAssembly itself, there are two different ways that you can host your Blazor WebAssembly applications. So if you're building a full stack .NET application, you can have it hosted within your ASP.NET project. So you might have your API layer that's your ASP.NET Core and everything, and you have your Blazor WebAssembly hosted alongside that. Or you can have it standalone. So this is where you can leverage the globally distributed hosting, and you have your APIs as more of individual microservices rather than one big monolithic repository. So when we're looking at using static web apps, we're focusing on this standalone side. So what we have with the two different options, because our APIs, we want them to be some sort of serverless option, like our Azure Functions or the microservices in our backend. And we want to be able to leverage that globally distributed hosting that we get with the static web apps feature as well. So the built-in backend option, the first class integration, as you will, there are others that we'll look at, but the built-in one is using Azure Functions with .NET. So Azure Functions are the serverless solution. So if you worked with AWS and use Lambda functions, this is Azure's version of that. But they're really just small little code blocks that are an individual function that execute based on some sort of trigger. So generally with the static web apps, it might be something like your HTTP request that kicks off your function to, say, get the information that your front end needs. But because it's serverless, you have automated scaling available for you within the cloud. It's all based on the needs of your application. So you get all of those benefits here. You don't have to worry about any of the infrastructure management. It's all set up and does the configuration for you. And it has a lot of flexible pricing options available. And something new that came out in .NET 7 is the isolated worker model. So this is now the default way for building your Azure Functions. And basically, it's some improvements that help you to, I have a slide that tells you what it's about, that helps you to have everything in an isolated runtime. So if you've built .NET applications in the past, you're probably familiar with how you do the dependency injection and that kind of thing. And if you tried to do that within your Azure function, it was possible, but it was done in a very different way. So it was a bit harder to set up, harder to configure. But now with the isolated worker model, they've aligned it to how it's done in the normal .NET development. So it's more natural, it's more similar to what we're used to working with. And it means there's more control over the process. You also get more support for adding in different types of middleware and stuff like that. So it's a good improvement on the way that Azure Functions run, which is nice. And all of this is supported with the static web apps. So you can leverage all of the latest features when you're building your static web apps. So let's take a look at how we can get started building our static web apps using fullstack.net. So I have my Visual Studio. Oh, maybe I don't. I have to stop the presentation. Go here. I might have to, there we go. Have my Visual Studio. I'm just going to zoom in, see if this works here quickly to this right-hand side. So the way the projects are normally set up when you're just building a static web app is you'll generally have, what they recommend is generally to have 3 different projects within your solution. So you'll have one for your client, which is, in our case, it's our Blazor application, so it's all of our front-end code. And then you'll have one for your API, which in this case is the Azure Functions, which we're using the managed within the static web app version. And then some sort of shared library. So often what you'll do is put, say, shared data models, or if there's any types of shared classes that you need to do things like configuring extra authentication or managing the authorization, that kind of stuff, you can put it in these shared libraries. Anything that you want accessed across both the front and back end, you can use shared. So that's one of the benefits of doing the full stack .NET applications. So close out the Zoom. So this is just a basic, if you've seen working with the templates that they give you with Blazor and Azure Functions, it's the weather forecast is the thing that we know and love. Hopefully that's big enough. So this just has a basic get Azure function to get a forecast for you. But we'll look at the Blazor on the front end, which is using, so Blazor pages. So when you're setting up a page in Blazor, it's using something called Blazor pages. So Blazor kind of was formed from, if you worked with Blazor pages in the past. But the way they set it up is at the beginning, at the top, you have things like your page routing definition. You can do dependency injection. So here we're injecting an HTTP client. And then you just define your page layout. So your HTML and all of that will be defined here. And then the actual code for execution behind the page is in C#. So we're using our C#, our .NET here to execute and hit the API and get all of the weather forecast details. And we have our models, our shared model is just a normal class like you would have in your .NET applications. But I want to show you how we can get this very quickly in just a few steps up onto Azure. So at the moment, I have it on GitHub, but I haven't deployed it anywhere. It's just on my local machine. And I don't have any, I'll be using something called GitHub Actions, but I don't have any actions or anything to set up to deploy at the moment. You can see that it's empty. It's telling me, here's some suggestions on things you can do to deploy your application. But we're going to let Azure set that up for us. So I'm going to go to the Azure portal, and I'm going to say create. If you saw Lars's talk earlier, he mentioned you always want to have a resource group for specific things you're working on. I have one set up for this conference today, so I can also go and delete the resources after I'm done and not be charged for things in the end. But you can just search for static web app, and we'll say create. And so this is just how to do it through the wizard, but you can do this through the command line, and you can do your infrastructure and as code to set this all up as well. But we're just going to do this so you can see what it looks like. So we're just going to call it Programmable or to program static web app demo. You might also hear SWA use, which is really just SWA, so that's kind of a shorthand people use for static web apps. There are two hosting plan options. So there's a free one, which is great for your personal websites or your side projects or whatnot, and then a standard, which is if you're in a more enterprise company, you might want to use the standard plan. So with the differences between the two, so standard you do get, it costs about $12 a month, so it's still quite affordable if you're especially a big organization. But you do get more domains, you get the ability to add in custom authentication, private endpoints, you can add a bit more security, and more options with the API backends that we'll look at in a little bit as well. But for this, we're just going to say free, because we don't need any of those fancy features. There is a limitation on the environments, but those environments, the locations, but those locations are only used for the Azure Functions at the moment. So we mentioned globally distributed static content, so it's all served basically from a CDN wherever people might be in the world. But your backend will be hosted somewhere, so you choose a location for that. So, I forgot my login. We're just going to sign in to our GitHub. It's usually signed in for me, but we'll just do this quickly. Authorize. And I need to have 2FA set up, which you all should have, and I think GitHub are making it so you have to soon. Luckily, I have my phone here. But basically, you authenticate to your GitHub, and then it's attached to your account. And you can see that there's an option there for Azure DevOps as well. So you can set up the CI/CD through GitHub, Azure DevOps, and there's this other. So there is support for custom options, and there's now GitLab and Bitbucket are supported in there as well. But it knows all of the organizations you're a part of. So if you're working for a company or an organization, that should be available there. And then you find the repo that you want, and it'll ask you your branch. So if any sort of branching strategy you have, you can set this up there for you. And then the build presets, you can see some of the options of the other frameworks that are available there for you. And there's even, I think, a custom down at the bottom. So you're really unlimited with whatever static content you want on the front end. But we're going to go with Blazor. And then it has some of the default locations following that pattern of the client and the API libraries that we saw. And we're going to go review and create, and then it should create this for us. And what it's actually going to do is, because we've authenticated to our GitHub, it's going to go over to our GitHub repository. It's going to set up the GitHub Actions workflow file for us, which we'll take a look at in a second, which will actually do the builds and deployments for us on every commit to main, and also when a pull request happens, it'll open up that staging environment for us as well. So it sets that all up for you, so you don't actually need to understand or know how GitHub Actions works, although it does help, and it's good to know what's happening behind the scenes, but it's a nice, easy way to get that started. And it'll set up some secrets as well, so that it'll have that authentication into Azure, and it'll have those secrets set up within your GitHub pipelines. So if I go back to my repository and go to the code, we should see there, so now it did a commit. So this was Azure doing the commit for us. And we have this new workflow file, which is our GitHub action workflow. I can make that a little bigger for you. So as I said, it's doing build and deployment, and it's looking at your main branch, and it's also based on when the pull requests are opened, it'll create a staging environment for you, and then once that pull request is closed, it'll delete the staging environment. You can also set up staging environments that are always there and have static names and stuff like that, but this is a nice, quick, easy way to see the code as you go, and that's all set up for you, which is really cool. It has also already kicked off the action, so part of what it does, I don't know why there's 2 in there, but part of what it does is it'll immediately kick off that action for you and start running the workflow file. It does take a few minutes, but once it's done, your website will be available on this fun little generated URL that it's created for us, which here is Jolly Coast something. But it's nice that it also has these links back to the different environments and everything like that as well. It's also shown us, if we go to the APIs section, we can see that it's set up, or once it's all done, because it's still processing, it'll set up those managed functions for us in the back end, which is nice. So we can go look at the functions linked in through there. So I have a complete one. If you want to see just the action when it's run, it'll have just this little, I did a change. So every time you do a change, it'll run a new one. But you can look at the code and see what it's doing. It'll have all kinds of notes for you. I think including at one point, it'll tell you, hey, it's available on this fun website. But you can also go into the portal and look from there and link. Here you go. Agreeable Beach is this one, but you can visit your site directly from the build notes, so you can see what is happening, and it's just that Blazor template that we saw. But everything is up and running. It's connected your front and back end. One of the cool things is it also takes care of things like the CORS rules, so you don't have any of that cross-origin issues between the front and back end. It's done all that configuration for you. So you don't have to worry about things communicating together. It knows how to do it on its own. And we can see it has a SSL cert here. It's all HTTPS. So we didn't have to do any of that, and it's up and running, which is nice. So if I go back to my slides, put this in presentation mode. So we just saw the deployment and how you can just from within the portal really easily get it up and running, and then it automatically builds and deploys it for you and puts it out into the cloud. So it has that first class integration. We saw how we could do it with GitHub and GitHub Actions, but it also has first class with Azure DevOps and using their pipelines as well. So it'll do a very similar type of thing there. And then it'll continuously automatically build and deploy our code changes as we push them to main. And as I mentioned, we'll create those staging versions based on the pull requests, and everything is then distributed for us, and there's a few other options for support for your deployment as well, and they're continuously adding in new options to support or ways to customize it for you. So when we're talking about doing our local development, there's also some really great tools that can help you with this as well. So one of them is the Azure Static Web Apps CLI. So the CLI is specifically for static web apps built by Microsoft, and you can actually initialize your projects, do log into your Azure and play around with things. You can do your deployments from that command line as well, and you can also do some testing and configuration. But it's really nice for local debugging and to figure out how your application is going to function when it's deployed on the cloud. And the really nice thing that it works, I mentioned that the Azure Static Web Apps takes care of those CORS routing rules and things like that. So you can have your front and back end communicating with each other. Everything is routed through the same port, and you don't have to worry about the CORS request, cross-origin resource. And when you're doing your local development, this tool sets that up for you as well. So it'll actually proxy all of your requests to where your front-end application is running, in your back-end application, in your local machine, where those are running. It'll proxy it all through one port, and it'll simulate what Azure is doing in the cloud. We have some built-in authentication that Azure sets up for you. And this has authentication with GitHub and Twitter and your Azure AD. And this tool allows you to emulate that authentication through that same proxy and same port as well. So you can play around with how the authentication works with what is built in by Azure when you're working in the cloud, which is really nice. So before I move on, I want to show you quickly how that works. So I'll go to my Visual Studio Code this time. So you can use this CLI from, if you have your Visual Studio open, you can open a terminal, run the CLI. You can do it in many different ways, but because I don't need the running capabilities that Visual Studio gives me, if I'm using the CLI, I like to use Visual Studio Code. And there's actually an extension within Visual Studio Code for static web apps as well, which is really nice. If you run the initialization command, it'll set up some configuration rules for you, which are things like, where is your client app located, your API, that kind of stuff, in all of that. So I've already done that part. And then all I need to do is say, I think it's while I start, and it should run it. So what we'll see is, so it's saying, it's not going to match the cloud environment exactly, but it gives us something close. And it'll actually start .NET hot reload as well. So if you're making changes to your .NET application, you'll be able to watch them. So here it's already started the localhost 5000, which is the port just for the client side. But we'll see it'll also start on 7071. It has our Azure Functions running. So we want to access it through the proxy Static Web Apps emulator, which is this port 420. And we can see it's going really fast. It's just loading everything. But it's proxying all of the different requests for the different pieces that are being loaded for the app there. And it's opened up here. So this is the 4280. And if I go to the page where it's fetching data from the API, and then go back to the console, I can see that it hit the API endpoint, and that was all proxied through the Static Web App CLI, and we're able to test that out and see what it looks like. If I go to, if I just remember, it's /auth, I think. Let's try, see if I get it right. Is it .auth or /auth? Can't remember the URL now. .auth. There's something, I have to take out the fetch data, that's why. So usually you would build into your app, you would build in the, here you go. So you have the .auth/login/Twitter. So here you go. So this is all through the emulator. So there's a secret folder or pathway that's the .auth that Static Web Apps sets up for you. And it sets it up for you there in the cloud. But here we're doing it locally. And this is the emulator for how the authentication works. So you can do things like configuring the user's roles and the claims and really test out how it'll function once you actually deploy it, which is really nice. So there's some cool features that you have there. So I'm just going to stop this running so it doesn't mess anything up. And we'll go back to the slides. So there's a brand new feature that was released in the last 10 days, I think it is, is currently in public preview, but it's actually really, really cool. So I wanted to add it in here and make sure that I shared it with you all today. So there's a new feature called database connections for Azure Static Web Apps. And what this does is it actually allows you to connect your static web app with a database and immediately start making your REST and GraphQL calls. So you don't have to configure endpoints to do like select statements and that kind of stuff to your database. The database connections will configure all of that for you. So it'll set up a new route called Data API. And behind that, it'll create a whole bunch of endpoints, allow you to do all of your CRUD requests. And you can do it through REST or GraphQL, which is really nice. And it's all configured for you. So you can retrieve and modify those database entities directly from your static site, focusing really on building those applications. And it has flexibility with different database types that you can add in there as well. So some sort of Azure database, so it could be Azure SQL, Postgres, you could use Cosmos and NoSQL type of database, but it sets up the authentication for you as well. It has the ability to have all kinds of different relationships. It's optimized queries, and it's really scalable as well because it's all serverless and built by Azure within Azure for you. So it's using a strong security model, role-based security, all of that. And under the hood, what it's using is something called the Data API Builder, which is an open source Microsoft engine that converts your REST and GraphQL to optimize database queries. So this engine takes just in different schemas, and you need to configuration for how the entities and relationships are all going to work, a configuration file. And then the Data API Builder, this engine, will extract that schema from your configuration and build those endpoints for you, so all the REST and GraphQL endpoints. So you can connect it to any of these number of databases that we talked about. And so you're really accessing data using modern techniques on any platform in any language. So this is not just available in .NET, it's available in a whole bunch of different types of languages as well. So you could probably do a full talk on the Data API Builder in itself. So I would recommend checking it out, but it's something really cool that's fairly new from Microsoft. But yeah, it has different support for like OAuth and JWT. But really, it has now full integration with static web apps using the database connection feature when you're running in Azure, which is really cool. But the database connection feature with static web apps is still in preview, but it's nice to go ahead and play around with it a bit and see what you can do there. So I want to take you through a demo. And this demo I did not write. It was actually written by a guy named Aaron Powell, who was one of the speakers in the Sydney Programmable on Thursday. And so he set this up and very nicely shared it with me, which is great. And he's a developer advocate at Microsoft, so he knows what he's doing. But basically, so this project here, and I'll share all my resources at the end as well, which includes a link to this GitHub repo. And he's very nicely set it up for us in a dev container, which actually sets up a Docker container on your machine with all of the different resources and stuff that you need. So you don't have to install any tools other than having Docker set up in all of that as well, which is nice. So what he has done here is he's first set up an Azure database he defines the entities and the schema. So we're using a SQL database here. So he just has, this is going to be a trivia application. So he defines a whole bunch of data that will eventually be seeded into the database. And then he has a create table SQL action here, which will then create the table with the right schema. And we have a script that he's written that'll set up the database with everything for us as well. So again, I'll share this with you so you can see what he's done, but that's to set up the Azure database for you so you can do it both locally and then once you go out into the real world. And then past that, because we're using the static web apps database connection, within, I think there's a data folder here where he's set up the configuration for the database. And he has a blog post where he takes you through the different steps and what all these things mean. But you have things like your data source, so the connection string for whichever database that you want to connect to. So if you set one up separately, And then it's looking at, how do you run it locally? We want to use that same port 4280 to connect. So it's going to be going, you can use the Static Web Apps CLI. They've actually updated it for this feature as well. So you can do those same proxying of requests with the CLI as well, and uses the built-in Static Web Apps authentication. And then defining the entities that will go into that database. The next thing that he's done, so in his example here, he's using GraphQL, which is a very powerful querying language. So GraphQL, here you only need the client side. So he's using a client library called Strawberry Shake, which is a .NET GraphQL client. And here he has a query to get the questions from the database. So he's just querying a whole bunch of these questions. And then within his Blazor page, so he has just a basic page, which is showing all the questions on the screen. But here we're accessing the client saying, get me the questions, and then we'll process those as we go. So if I start this up and show you what it looks like, as I said, if you check out this repo yourself, you can set up the dev container, which comes with Visual Studio Code. It's a really cool feature in itself. You can have everything set up and working for you pretty quickly, which is nice. So it's using the Static Web Apps CLI behind the scenes, but running slowly for some reason. You can also, so basically what it'll do is, I mentioned it has that data /API endpoint that Azure Static Web Apps sets up for you. In this case, the CLI is setting it up for us. You could also navigate to that with a GraphQL browser to sort of play around with the backend, or if you want to set up the REST endpoints, you can play around with that as well. Great, so the CLI has now decided to run. Probably won't look too much different. We're not going to open the 500 because that's just the client. We want to open the 4280 when that is ready. But it's basically just another Blazor application that has all of the questions, and we'll be able to see the request to the GraphQL server as well. Once that's there, here we go. I want to open this, say inspect. Here's my network. Cool. If I expand this out, so we can see that it's called out GraphQL, and if it's using that /data API, which is the endpoint through Static Web Apps that wasn't configured in the code at all. And it responded with all of the data, all the questions that are now, they're set up within a SQL database, which is part of in this case, it's part of the dev container. It's already set up on my machine, but in the real world, you could connect out to any sort of Azure database that you have. So it's a really cool feature that is now available for us to use. So you don't have to build those APIs if you don't want to. But another important thing I should mention, and this was taken directly from a blog post by one of the product managers at Microsoft, a guy named Thomas Galvin, who is a product manager on Static Web Apps, talking about the best practices with using Static Web Apps. He wanted to make it clear that when looking at the database connections and those database access API compared with the different backend options, such as Azure Functions that are available, you can actually combine the two, and that's the best approach, is looking at your use cases. So when you just have, you just need to very simply query data, retrieve data, that kind of stuff, you can use these database connections. But when you have a bit more complexity on how you want to handle your information in the backend, then you can use your Azure Functions. So you can definitely use them together, and that is the approach they recommend. And you can see a little bit of the architecture on how that would work here within the Static Web Apps. So something really cool that's brand new. So I talked about there are other API backend options other than the Azure Functions. So if you're on the standard plan, you can do something called bring your own backend. So instead of having the Azure function, which is managed within the static web app, you can connect to an existing backend. And that backend could be other Azure functions that are managed elsewhere by yourself, or it could be your Azure API managers, could be app services, or it could be Azure Container Apps. So all of these options are available on the standard plan, and there are different ways to add to your backend. So you can really have, if you have all your microservices that are already really powerful, written in something like Container Apps, you can connect those up to your static content in the front end. So one of these options that I'm really excited about and I'm using a lot are Azure Container Apps. So these are serverless containers for microservices. They're ways to build your web APIs and really allow you to focus on the apps, not the infrastructure. So it's a serverless container option within Azure, which is really cool. And I want to show you how we can connect these backends to our applications. So I'm going to say in slideshow. Don't have too much time, but basically what you would do, so this static web app that I have set up here is using the standard plan. So, everything's, oh no, it's black on the other screen. So when you're using the standard plan, you can use the bring your own. It's just a Blazor front-end application, so there is nothing on the back end here. But what we can do is click this link button, and then we can choose from the drop down, and we're going to choose a container app. And I'm going to say the programmable one, and we can link these two together. And what it will actually do is it'll configure all of the requests to that backend service can now only come from your static web app. So it actually locks down that backend traffic immediately to only be from your static web app, which is really nice. And it, again, sets up those cross-origin resource rules, so everything is going through that same port, and it's accessed in the same way. And if we now go to that backend resource, we'll be able to look at, I think it's in identity. Maybe it's authentication, sorry. Yeah, so in authentication, we now have the identity provider is that Azure Static Web Apps. So it's immediately set everything for us there. If we navigated to the front end of the application, it'll already be set up and connected to our backend, and we can access everything together immediately. So I didn't show you the front end before. Again, it's just a normal Blazor app, but the data before said, please connect to backend. And then here, it should actually connect. Sometimes it takes a little, oh, there you go. So I said it's coming from the container app, so you know it's coming from there. One thing, if you are doing the bring your own API backend option, when you're configuring your controllers, you do need to make sure that you add the API into the route, because Static Web Apps doesn't do that for you, but it assumes that that API is there. So if you can see in the route here, I have API slashed at the beginning of my controller name. So that's the only real difference. Otherwise, this is just a normal application. So I want to get into a few more of the exciting things. And I'm running out of time. So hopefully we can get through it. So if you want to get into more of the enterprise level, again, with the standard plan, there's something called Enterprise Grade Edge, which gives you extra capabilities for serving that static content, caching assets at the edge, making things load faster, and have advanced security for your assets as well. We talked about there's some authentication options. So there is built-in authentication that's available on the free plan through Azure Active Directory, GitHub, and Twitter. And if you're using the standard plan, there is options to add in authentication with custom providers for you as well. So I want to show you a bit more of an advanced demo. And it's not a full enterprise level app, but something a bit different than just the little weather forecast that you see quite often. So we mentioned that I enjoy wine. I can't drink wine at the moment, but my husband is actually a winemaker, and I recently moved to Margaret River wine region over in Western Australia. And we've actually made our own wine. We have our own wine business. So I decided to set up our website using Azure Static Web Apps with fullstack.NET. So this is a Blazor WebAssembly web app with some Azure Functions in the back end. If you can see up here at the top, I have a custom domain. Everything's all certified there. There's just some basic pages. We're not actually selling the wine yet. Be ready to sell in just a couple months, so we say coming soon. And there's some information about us and stuff as well. Well, I'll quickly show you the code with that. So you can see it looked a little bit different from the template. I'm using a component library called Mud Blazor. So if you're working with Blazor, it's similar to your other component libraries where you can, or your other front-end frameworks where you can use different component libraries to help make your applications look pretty without having to write a whole lot of CSS yourself, which is nice. So things like the title and the text is just being styled through that as well. I have things like the carousel, which is the images floating through, that comes from that as well. And then I have on the shop page things like calls to the API, which would get the products if I had any products available to sell that are showing there. So I have a get endpoint, which is just another Azure function, which is actually calling a SQL database in this case. So I set this up before the database connections was ready, or before it was even announced, so I didn't know it was coming. But in this case, I'm using Entity Framework to access my database. So you can use some of those more advanced features. I'm using the isolated worker model, so I'm able to do the dependency injection and set up my my entity framework in the same kind of way you would in your normal applications. So then I can just do context and getting all of the products there. So how you can see, this is where the configuration for using entity framework is happening. I also have a post request because in the future, I want to, from within my application, be able to set up new wines. So say, for example, if my husband wanted to add in a new wine that we're going to sell, he is not a programmer, so I don't want him have to go, do some SQL updates or whatnot. Hopefully he can eventually do that from the front end and hit this endpoint. But I do want to make sure it's secure. So initially, I've done sort of like the very minimum to lock it down, which is using some of the static web apps, routing built-in authentication configuration. So I'm saying to be able to even hit this API products endpoint, you have to be in an authorized role. So you can use the static web apps configuration to do things like that, as well as saying, these types of people can only access these pages, and there's quite a lot that you can do within the static web apps feature itself for that. I've also started doing some more work on how the authentication features can look, and I've set that up within a pull request. And as I mentioned, when you create a pull request, it actually sets up a staging site for you to be able to preview what you have changed. So within my changes, I've added some stuff to the front end to have, I'm using the cascading authentication state, which is the authentication state within Blazor that's passed through the different pages. I've added a page currently blank for where you could eventually add the products, and just a page to take care of the login for us here. So these are going to that /auth route that I mentioned before is set up through Static Web Apps, but it's just going to put some buttons on the page for us to make it look nice. So if we go back to the conversation for this pull request, we'll see the GitHub Actions bot has run, and it's set up my staging site for me here. And one thing to mention with these, if you're on the free plan, these staging sites are publicly accessible. So if someone got the URL Gentle Sand with all the numbers on there, people could see what you're working on. So that's why it's better to get into the, the standard plan so you can lock those down a bit more. But I have this new login page, which has these buttons for logging in with GitHub or Twitter. I'm going to try, hopefully the GitHub it's working. And then it'll ask, do you want to authorize the service? I'll authorize it. And this is, because it's in that staging site, it's actually going to my Twitter account or my GitHub account and authorizing it there. And now I have access to this new Add Products page, which I mentioned is blank because I haven't built it yet. But it's cool. So I can add in a whole bunch of new features there. There's some great things available. I have the custom domain. I have my staging sites. I'm able to play around with all these different features and make it look more professional and build a great website using some of these static web apps features and get up and running quite quickly. And now I can play around with the database connections that we have as well, which is cool, and add in some new things like that. So that was a quick demo on that. So in summary, we've seen a whole bunch about static web apps, how you can get up and running quite quickly, how you can use it with your full stack .NET applications using Blazor WebAssembly in the front end and .NET in the back end. We've seen how it does those automatic build and deployment changes, some of the other backend options, the new database connection feature that's available for you now, and talked a little bit about how you can get into more enterprise level applications. There's also options to set all this stuff up through things like infrastructure as code. You can add in new types of things to your pipelines, things like tests, which are always good, and continue with the customizations while still leveraging all the stuff you get within Azure Static Web Apps. So to get started today, there's tons of free learning resources out there. I'll share another link that has everything collated in one spot. But there is that free plan for you to try it. There's tons more that I didn't cover today, but it really makes it easy for you to get up and running. So thank you very much for coming to my talk today. If you scan the QR code on the screen or go to the URL, you can access all of my demos and resources from the talk here today and my slides as well. So thank you very much, everybody.